Afternoon, everyone. Just to remind you before we begin today that Group B will be presenting on Wednesday. Losing lost track, so we'll look forward to that. And then Group C will follow on after next week, a week today, with Ibn Warwick's book, Why I'm Not Muslim. So that will be interesting, and considering what's happened to Salman Rushdie when he wrote Satanic Verses, I think it's a pretty brave title for a book. So we'll look forward to Group C's presentation. I'm delighted today to introduce our guest speaker, who is Professor James H.D. He is a longtime professor, retired from the University of Illinois in Chicago. He taught there for over 25 years. And is now a visiting scholar at UT. He's a professor of classics. And so you hear a very detailed analysis of what we just briefly introduced on Wednesday of last week when we looked at the historical Jesus debate. Professor D is a prolific publisher as well. He has written over 36 articles and 9 books. And again, he's delivered more than 50 convention papers. So again, he's a leading scholar in his field and continues to make presentations as well. So he is very active in his quote-unquote retirement. He is also known for publishing a lot of op-eds. So if you look at the Austin American Statesman, if you read the Austin American Statesman, you are bound to come across one of Professor D's op-eds, and the one that he is most infamous, I guess would be the term, was his 2005 Easter op-ed about the resurrection of Jesus and the historical evidence for that. So he is here today to talk about the historical evidence for the resurrection and many other issues as well. So please join me in welcoming Professor D.
Thank you. Innes, I get tired listening to the resume of my own life. It's very depressing. I must be older than I think. Before we get into this topic, I'd like to thank Professor Mitchell for his invitation. The mere fact that this course is being offered at all and at a university with a strong institutional religious commitment is quite remarkable. I'm not aware of any other college or university course that even comes close to the syllabus of this one. It's an honor to be part of such an undertaking, and I'll try not to fall short of the standard already set by the course itself. The subject for the next 64 minutes or so has occupied the minds of countless very bright and very serious people for almost 2,000 years. So if you think I can solve all its complexities in a single class period, it's not going to happen. But I do hope you'll leave the room with more information and maybe more ideas than you had coming in. I left academic life before the PowerPoint revolution. This is how long ago it was. So I provide old-fashioned handouts, things you can keep and not ephemeral eye candy. So I will pass these around. Meant to be thoroughly intimidating. I need to say first, as was just said, but maybe it didn't register, that I'm not a Bible scholar. My training was in classics, the study of the languages and cultures of pagan Greece and Rome, which means that Hebrew and Aramaic, the only languages of interest to the historical Jesus, were not part of my experience. In putting together the perhaps disconcerting quantity of material in those handout pages going around, I have been aware, although you might not think so, that this is a course in communication, not biblical scholarship. I did this on purpose for 2 reasons. Number 1, after a singularly inauspicious start, the supremely degrading and embarrassing execution of its leader, Christianity became a spectacularly successful religion with more than 2 billion adherents today, distributed among more than 33,000 different denominations. And yet, after the first 40 days, there were no more authentic sightings of Jesus and no physical proof of his resurrection. Christianity grew by the persuasive power of its fervent believers, in other words, by extremely effective communication. Part of what I'll try to do this afternoon is to show how important those communication skills must have been, since the evidence backing up their claims was alarmingly weak to start with and only got weaker as time went on. In a few decades, by about 70 CE, all the 12 apostles Gospels and other eyewitnesses to Jesus' life would have been dead, and for an unknown amount of time after the 30s, nothing but oral tradition linked the later generations of Christians to the alleged events of the by then distant past. Second item. Your course is exploring the opinions and writings of a wide range of unbelievers. They too are trying to change minds about religion, just as the early Christians did. A notoriously difficult task. A few are brilliantly effective speakers, but often bitter and derisive. Somehow the late Christopher Hitchens comes to mind. That may encourage those already agreeing, but is unlikely to persuade the committed to reconsider. Even worse, all too often, regardless of their style, the new atheists and other anti-religionists are just not properly equipped. For example, the so-called Four Horsemen, Hitchens, a political, social, literary critic, Richard Dawkins, a biologist, Dan Dennett, a neuroscientist and philosopher, and Sam Harris, another neuroscientist, simply don't have the professional credentials to talk about God or Jesus or the Bible. But the real challenge in attempting persuasive communication in this hypersensitive area is putting into people's hands, in this case, your hands, information that might contribute to making more informed decisions and leaving the rest to your own sense of rightness, also known as your conscience. That's my justification for the sensory overload that's going to be dumped on y'all in the next half hour. We'll have to ask Professor Mitchell if sensory overload is a valid method of communication. Number A, letter A, background. You've already had a class session addressing this issue of the historical Jesus using Dan Barker's book, Godless. Barker, too, is not a trained Bible scholar. He was in Austin several years ago, and I asked him how many years of Hebrew and Greek he had in ministry school. The answer was Greek 2, Hebrew 0. 2 years of New Testament-oriented Greek wouldn't be much compared to the problems of those texts, and talking in a church about the Hebrew Bible when you've never studied Hebrew is, as I put it in one of those lessons in this op-ed several years ago, the blind leading the blinder. Page 1 of your handout has several entry points into this extraordinarily complex realm. The late Father Raymond Brown's huge work, item number 1, is probably the most thorough and up-to-date introduction to the whole New Testament. I should add, this may be necessary even at a Catholic university, that the SS after his name is for Saint Sulpicius, a small order of Catholic priests. Unlike John Meyer at items 4 and 5, he was not S.J., a Jesuit, and he was definitely not a Nazi. I'll focus exclusively on biblical sources, ignoring the non-biblical apocryphal Gospels, which were dismissed as non-authentic by early Christian authorities, although some of those non-authentic texts were very popular in previous centuries. Most of them are clearly 2nd century or later, and some are so childishly fantastical that no mature adult in this century should take them as historical evidence, although sometimes Jesus Seminary does. For example, in one apocryphal text, the Gospel of Peter, when the tomb opens up on Easter morning, a giant Jesus emerges, crammed in the tomb, at least, supported by 2 other giant figures. Their heads reach up to the sky, his head extends above the skies, and his cross comes out of the tomb itself. The text doesn't say whether it walks or floats or hops. And the cross even speaks, saying a word in Greek, figures that seem to belong in a Saturday morning cartoon. If you are, in spite of what I just said, curious about these strange texts, there is now a very respectable collection, item number 2, that gives both the original languages and English. Item number 3 is Albert Schweitzer's classic account of the first quest of the historical Jesus, that is, 19th century biographies. Schweitzer carefully shows how those attempts failed, largely because they refused to apply what is nowadays called the historical critical approach that had been exemplified in 1835 when the 28-year-old David Friedrich Strauss published a 1,400-page study called The Life of Jesus Critically Examined. The second quest, also called the New Quest, began with a lecture in 1953 by the German scholar Ernst Käsemann and ran out of steam apparently in the 70s. It too did not succeed in getting very much agreement about the historical Jesus. The third quest began somewhere in the 80s and seems to be going strong. You can look at the Wikipedia article, his quest for the historical Jesus, mentioned in the select bibliography line, and at item 4 on the handout. For a class like this, we don't have to go into arcane details. The important thing is that an awful lot of what most people still take as plain facts about Jesus have been abandoned by professional scholars. Here's a quote about the technique from Father Meyer, item 4, summarizing this trend. It is, after all, historical critical research that enables scholars of vastly different backgrounds and commitments to propose, test, and adjudicate claims in the public arena by commonly accepted criteria. That actually sounds like a definition of science research as much as biblical research. The significant phrases are historical, critical, test and adjudicate, commonly accepted criteria. Item number 5 on your list is the largest biographical study ever undertaken of Jesus, and it's not even finished at 3,000 pages. That's also John Meyer. If you have endless amounts of time, you can try fighting your way through it. Here's a quote from item 6, summarizing the historical critical biography of Jesus' life. Quote, most scholars agree that Jesus was baptized by John, debated with fellow Jews on how best to live according to God's will, engaged in healings and exorcisms, taught in parables, gathered male and female followers in Galilee, went to Jerusalem, and was crucified by Roman soldiers during the governorship of Pontius Pilate, 26 to 36 CE. End of quote. You might have noticed some things missing. No birthday story, no Christmas story, which is really 2 stories, one in Matthew, one in Luke, fully contradictory to each other. No spectacular miracles, and most important, no resurrection. But that's all that many serious scholars are willing to say after more than 2 centuries of historical critical analysis. However, if it's any consolation, at least the scholars aren't giving up on Jesus completely. There is a non-scholarly faction out there that denies the historical existence of the person called Jesus of Nazareth. Reminding you that this is not my specialty, I'll go ahead and endorse item 7, North Carolina professor Bart Ehrman's recent defense of the reality of the modern minimalist historical Jesus. That position does not imply any acceptance of the theological claims made about Jesus. As some of you might know, Ehrman started out as a hardcore literalist. He memorized the entire Greek text of the New Testament, quotes from memory, like that. At Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, and then at Wheaton College outside Chicago, but he became a mainstream historical critical scholar during his doctoral work at Princeton on the textual transmission of the New Testament, and he simultaneously defends the existence of Jesus while admitting that he's now an agnostic with atheist leanings. That's a direct quote. His unbelief began when he realized that there are so many variants among the 5,700 Greek manuscripts, whole or part, that no inerrant, original, divinely inspired text can ever be recovered. I've added at item 7 a reference to a YouTube video, this is for your generation's entertainment, of Ehrman from about 7 years ago when he was giving a talk at Stanford. And if you punch up Ehrman Stanford, I did this 2.5 hours ago, it comes up at the very top. It runs 1 hour 35:20. The most interesting part is at 1:22:30 in the question and answer, where someone asks why the audience should believe Ehrman over other writers who make what scholars regard as crackpot claims. The questioner mentions Janet Bach's book, The Jesus Mystery, and another book, both claiming that Jesus went to India from the age of 12 to the age of 30. At first, Bart just says authority. That's it. Then he senses that at a highly intellectual place like Stanford, and in the proverbially anti-authoritarian state of California, that arrogant approach ain't going to work. By the way, Ehrman has also written a book, item 8, that takes apart the Da Vinci Code, another example of what the professionals call the crackpot school of Bible books. Ehrman goes on in the video to give a pretty good summary of how to try to tell at least serious scholars from non-scholarly and unqualified people. He asks, do they teach? Where do they teach? Meaning, are they at respectable colleges and universities? Do they have degrees? He means PhDs, not bachelor's degrees. Are they, in scare quotes, independent researchers, a fudge term for people who are self-employed and usually don't have degrees and therefore aren't professionally qualified? He says to look at their books, especially the footnotes. Where did they get their information from? This is tricky for the non-scholars because anybody can put stuff into footnotes, and it's very hard to tell the good from the junk. The credible people, he says, are at reputable institutions like North Carolina and have reputable degrees. And their books are published by scholarly presses where there is an established process of evaluation, usually by outside referees. This is, again, parallel to the scientific method of approach in publication. That's just the sort of mindset that your teachers here and throughout the academic world hope you will acquire. But it's one of the towering ironies of our age that there is so much well-established scientific and scholarly information out there, where the truth is, and yet people flock to all manner of pseudoscience and pseudo-scholarship from people who get uncritical media coverage and sell millions of books, DVDs, and whatever. The pattern was established more than 60 years ago with Immanuel Velikovsky's Worlds in Collision, and continued in the 70s with Erich von Däniken's Chariots of the Gods, both classic crackpot works. As an antidote to that kind of ignorance, I've added at item 9 the late Martin Gardner's book, Fads and Fallacies in the Name of Science. It too was published more than 60 years ago, but it's very well done, and it's probably the funniest book ever